Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into a potential trade war, one that could hit something you use every single day,
Yeah.
energy. We're talking about what could happen if the U.S. slaps a 25% tariff on energy imports, specifically from Canada and Mexico.
Exactly. These tariffs are meant to help U.S. industries, sure, but they could end up causing a whole chain reaction in the North American energy market. And that could mean higher gas prices, maybe even problems with keeping the lights on.
So let's get to the basics first. How much oil does the U.S. actually get from Canada and Mexico?
You might be surprised. As of last year, Canada supplied a massive 62% of all the oil the U.S. imports. That's something like 3.8 million barrels every single day. They're our biggest supplier, hands down. Mexico, they're a smaller player, but they're still really important, especially because they provide a lot of heavy crude oil, the kind that a lot of U.S. refineries are specifically set up to use.
Okay, so what does this mean for me, the average person? Should I be getting ready for long lines at the gas station and a huge jump in my energy bills?
Well, it's definitely a real possibility. If we disrupt this flow of oil coming in, it could lead to those price hikes at the pump. And in a worst-case scenario, we could even see shortages, especially in those states that relied heavily on energy from Canada. It's almost like imagine the 1970s oil crisis happening again, but this time it's because of a trade war with our neighbors.
That's a bit unsettling to think about. So Canada is obviously the biggest player here. How are they reacting to the possibility of these tariffs?
They are not happy, and they're not just sitting back. One option that people are talking about is completely shutting down all oil exports to the U.S. A huge move, for sure, with potential economic and political consequences for both countries. It'd be like the nuclear option in a trade war.
Wow. That would certainly get everyone's attention. But is everyone in Canada on the same page about this?
There's a really interesting debate going on within Canada right now. You've got Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, who is pushing for using energy exports as a way to get what they want. He's even suggested they could cut off electricity exports, which would affect millions of Americans who rely on Canadian power.
Sounds like Ontario's ready to play hardball. What about Alberta? They're the ones producing most of Canada's oil, right?
Right, and the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, she's being a lot more cautious. She's worried about the economic consequences, especially for Alberta, which is basically the heart of Canada's oil production. Cutting off exports, it could really destabilize their energy sector. You're talking job losses, and even a potential hit to the Canadian dollar. It's a classic case of how do you balance economic interests with political maneuvering.
It sounds like Canada's internal politics are going to be a big factor in how all of this plays out. But what if, instead of a complete shutdown, Canada tries a more targeted approach?
Well, they could always hit back with tariffs of their own. They could focus on specific U.S. goods. It's a tactic they've used before. Like back in 2018, when the U.S. put tariffs on steel and aluminum, Canada came back with tariffs on things like bourbon, orange juice, even steel products.
Kind of a strategic counterpunch, targeting weak spots in the U.S. economy. Are there any other options Canada has besides tariffs or cutting off exports entirely?
Well, there's a long-term strategy they've been working on for a while now, diversifying their energy markets. They're investing in things like expanding the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which would give them better access to global markets, especially in Asia.
So the idea is instead of relying so much on the U.S. as their main customer, they spread out the risk. Makes sense strategically, regardless of this trade tension. What about domestically? What are they doing within Canada to prepare for a potential trade war?
They're putting a lot of focus on making sure they have a secure energy supply within Canada. So they're investing in renewables like wind and solar power, and they're putting energy efficiency programs into place. It helps reduce their reliance on exporting fossil fuels while also positioning them as a leader in the shift towards clean energy globally.
It sounds like they're thinking ahead, playing the long game. But for now, all eyes are still on oil and the potential fallout from these tariffs. We've talked a lot about Canada, but Mexico is also a major player in this. How are they getting ready to respond to potential U.S. tariffs?
Mexico's response, it could really hit your wallet hard. They're really tied to the U.S. economy, and they know how to use that to their advantage.
So what are we talking about here? What's their plan?
Well, President Claudia Sheinbaum has been pretty clear about this. Mexico is ready to hit back with their own tariffs on U.S. goods. It's that classic tit-for-tat approach.
So if the U.S. puts a 25% tariff on Mexican energy imports, does that mean we could see a 25% tariff on some of the stuff we get from Mexico? What would be the impact of that kind of trade war?
The Mexican government's saying these tariffs could lead to something like 400,000 U.S. jobs being lost and prices going up for American consumers. Because a lot of industries, they've got these really intertwined supply chains that cross back and forth over the U.S.-Mexico border.
400,000 jobs? That's a huge number. Can you give us a real-world example of how this might play out in a particular industry?
Sure, look at the car industry. A lot of times, car parts cross the border multiple times while they're being made. So if you throw tariffs in there, it's going to cause delays, it's going to increase costs, and ultimately it means cars get more expensive for you.
So I might have to wait longer to get a new car and pay more when I finally do. What other things people buy all the time, could be affected by these tariffs?
Well, Mexico is a major exporter of agricultural products to the U.S. Think about all that corn, soybeans, meat you buy at the grocery store. A lot of that comes from Mexico. So if they put tariffs on those things, it could hurt American farmers. And of course, you're going to see higher prices at the checkout.
So just to sum it up, we could end up paying more to fill up our gas tanks and to fill up our shopping carts because of this trade war. Is there any hope for a diplomatic solution here, or are we heading straight for a full-blown trade war?
There's always a chance things could be worked out through negotiations. Mexico's economy minister, Marcelo Ebrard, he said they want to find a solution through dialogue to avoid these tariffs actually being put in place. He believes that cooperation is essential, especially with all the shared challenges they have with the U.S., like migration and drug trafficking.
So the door to diplomacy isn't completely closed yet. That's good to hear. But even if they manage to avoid these specific tariffs, are we seeing a broader trend toward protectionism around the world?
Unfortunately, yeah, it seems like it. There's this growing movement toward more inward-looking policies all around the world. And this trend, it could have some serious consequences for the global economy.
It feels like we're at this crossroads. Do we choose cooperation, or do we go back to protectionism and risk a trade war that could hurt everyone? It's a big moment with potentially long-lasting effects. So besides trying to find a diplomatic solution, what can Mexico do to prepare for the potential impact of a trade war?
Mexico's been working on diversifying their trade relationships for a while now. They're trying to reduce their trade deficit with countries like China, and they're trying to attract more foreign investment.
So they're not putting all their eggs in one basket, so to speak. Which sectors are they focusing on in these diversification efforts?
They're really pushing key industries like automotive and aerospace. The idea is to make their economy more resilient and less dependent on the U.S. market.
Sounds like they're taking steps to control their own destiny. But let's be real here. Their economy is incredibly intertwined with the U.S. economy. It's hard to imagine a complete separation, isn't it?
You're right. The U.S. and Mexico, they're major trading partners. Their economies are really deeply integrated. To completely separate them would be incredibly difficult and expensive for both countries.
This really highlights how interconnected everything is in our world. What happens with these tariffs will have an impact on so many people on both sides of the border. And speaking of interconnectedness, we can't ignore the potential role that China could play in all of this. They're a major player in the global economy, and relations between the U.S. and China have been a bit tense lately. So we've talked about how these tariffs could affect North America, but this situation, it really has global implications.
Let's talk about China for a minute. How might they react to these tariffs, and what could that mean for the U.S.?
China's response, it could really shake things up. They're the world's second largest economy. They're a huge trading partner with the U.S. If they decide to retaliate, it could send shockwaves through the entire global economy.
What kind of counter moves are they thinking about? Are they going to try to stay out of it, or are they ready to jump in? China has hinted at a few different things they might do. One possibility is that they restrict exports to the U.S., or even stop them altogether. Imagine if suddenly all those goods from China just stopped coming. It would be a huge disruption to supply chains for American businesses, and it would likely lead to shortages for consumers.
That sounds like it would have a huge impact. But would China really be willing to take such a drastic step? Wouldn't that hurt their own economy too?
Well, China's been working on diversifying its trade relationships for years now. They've built strong ties with Europe, Asia, Africa. So while cutting off exports to the U.S. would definitely have an impact, they're not as reliant on the U.S. market as they used to be.
So they've got options, and they're not afraid to use them. What else are they considering besides restricting exports?
Retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods are another likely response. They could target things that are politically sensitive or really important to the U.S. economy, things like agricultural products or high-value goods like aircraft.
It's like this strategic game of economic chess, with each side trying to outmaneuver the other and inflict the most damage. What would the consequences be for the U.S. if China went down this road?
Well, China supplies a huge range of goods to the U.S., everything from electronics and machinery to those rare earth materials that are essential for high-tech industries. If those supply chains get disrupted, it would be chaotic for American businesses and consumers.
It's like a domino effect, isn't it? One disruption leads to another, and pretty soon the whole system is in trouble. This isn't just some abstract economic theory. It could have real consequences for people's jobs, their livelihoods.
Absolutely. We could see higher prices, job losses in industries that depend on imports from China, a slowdown in economic growth. It's a lose-lose situation for everyone.
So let's recap. Canada and Mexico might cut off energy exports. China's threatening to restrict trade. And there's the possibility of other countries joining in. It feels like we're on the verge of a perfect storm in the global economy.
It's definitely a volatile situation, and it really underscores how, in this interconnected world, protectionist policies can have unintended consequences that reach far beyond their intended target. When countries try to protect their own industries at the expense of others, it can set off a chain reaction that ends up hurting everyone.
It seems like we're at a really crucial point here. We can choose cooperation and collaboration. Or we can retreat into protectionism and risk a global trade war that could damage the entire world economy.
The stakes are incredibly high. The decisions that are made in the coming months, they're going to have a lasting impact on the global economic landscape.
It can be overwhelming to think about all these global forces at play. What can the average person do when faced with something as complex as a potential global trade war?
We may not have control over international trade policy, but we can make our voices heard. Stay informed about these issues, talk about them with others, let your elected officials know that you support policies that promote cooperation and free trade. Those things can actually make a difference.
So knowledge is power, and being engaged is key. We can't just sit back and watch. We need to actively participate in shaping the future.
Exactly. And beyond advocating for sensible trade policies, we can focus on building more resilient communities and economies, supporting local businesses, investing in renewable energy, working to create a more sustainable and equitable society.
So it's about taking action at both the local and the global level. We don't have to wait for world leaders to make the right choices. We can be part of the solution ourselves.
That's exactly what this deep dive is all about. We want to give you the knowledge and encourage you to think critically about these complex challenges facing our world. The future isn't set in stone. It's something we create together.
That's a really important message, and a great place to wrap things up. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the potential trade war and what it could mean for the world. We hope you found it insightful and that you stay curious and engaged.
Remember, the world is always changing, and we all have a role to play in shaping its future. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and stay engaged.
Thanks for listening.